Today, we're going to be speaking with Dr. Stephen Novella, who is a neurologist, host, and producer of the award-winning podcast, The Skeptic's Guide to the Universe, and also lead author of the best-selling book by the same name. I really appreciate your time. It's great having you on today.
Oh, thanks for having me on. It's great to be here.
You've the book and the podcast, really, these are excellent sources for thinking about how to evaluate why we believe the things we believe, why others believe the things they believe, how to engage with epistemology and critical thinking, which is so important right now. We could start this conversation any of a number of different ways. Can you talk a little bit first generally about the approach you find most useful when engaging with people with different views to kind of create a baseline from which we can have conversations about, do we believe things that are actually true? What's the general approach that you propose?
Yeah, well, I think saying that we need a baseline is a good approach. The first step is always to establish some common ground, because if you don't have common ground, pretty much you're just fighting, right? You're not talking, you're not engaging, you're not going to make any progress. And you might have to back up quite a ways to find out where that common ground is. People make a lot of assumptions. They don't even realize how many different things go into their worldview and how many assumptions are in there, and that somebody else might not share those same assumptions. So even things like, how do we know it's real? Or what evidence is reliable evidence, et cetera. Once you establish that common ground, you might actually also be surprised to find how that you have a lot more common ground than you may think. That's another common experience, and then you can build slowly, carefully from there. What are the goals? How are we going to figure out, how to proceed here? I think that's a general picture. If you just back up and find common ground, that's a good way to begin.
There are some pitfalls sometimes in a lot of these conversations, and I'm curious as to your thoughts about how to navigate them. There's these concepts that are often bandied about, like Dunning-Kruger, the idea that someone lacks the ability or knowledge to understand that they are not necessarily fully equipped to have a certain conversation, which comes off as very insulting sometimes, to say to someone, in whatever words you want to use, Dunning-Kruger may be limiting your ability to engage meaningfully in this conversation. The reality is sometimes people are kind of in over their heads. So what are some more productive ways maybe to establish that someone may just not have all of the information to engage?
Yeah, so I think the first realization is that Dunning-Kruger and logical fallacies, critical thinking skills, media literacy, these things don't apply to other people. They apply to you. They apply to everyone. So if you're using these critical thinking concepts as a weapon in order to essentially knock down or attack somebody else, you're doing it wrong. These mainly are methods of policing your own thinking. And so like Dunning-Kruger, it doesn't mean that some people are like don't have the information to evaluate their ignorance. It's everybody does, just to a different degree on different topics. But unless you're at the cutting edge of world expertise in a very narrow topic, it applies to you. You don't have enough information to really meaningfully engage in how we know what we know about some cutting edge especially technical topic. And so the other half of that is what we call neuropsychological humility, right? So that we all have to be humble. I'm not saying that like you're dumb or you can't engage in critical thinking, or you're cognitively biased. It's we all are. We all need to confront the way our brains work, the way our logic tends to work, and again, this gets back to the common ground thing. Is like we all need to work together to identify the limitations in our knowledge, identify maybe some of the biases that we're working with, and then again see if we can build from there to some kind of common ground.
One of the things that particularly during the pandemic often comes up, and I get a lot of emails from people about this as well, is someone will say, yeah, okay, so the CDC and the WHO and my local doctor, they say this, but did you see that? Like Gary Null, for example, is a name that people often email me about. Or they'll say, or Dr. John Campbell on YouTube said this about ivermectin or whatever. And sometimes I have the instinct, like when callers say this stuff, to talk a little bit about credentials, like to say, well, you know, Dr. John Campbell, he has a doctorate in teaching nursing. He's not a medical doctor. But at the same time, I know that it's sort of an appeal to authority. But I recognize it might be relevant for someone to know whether we're talking to a medical doctor or not. Like it seems relevant, but at the same time, it's kind of just like going right to credentials. What makes sense when it comes to something like that?
This is perhaps the trickiest thing that we engage with because it's basically dueling experts, right? And you can find an expert to say whatever you want, to support whatever position you want to have. And you feel like I'm listening to the experts. I got these experts over here. And this phenomenon has been weaponized. It's not like it's just a random thing. There are people who are trying to lead you down a path paved with these cherry-picked outlier expert opinions or pseudo expert opinions, or sometimes they're not experts at all. And you have to be able to pick your way through that. But again, if you're not an expert, how do you do that? Again, you're not in a position to evaluate which experts are legitimate. So you need to have some basic algorithms that you use, some basic things, red flags or processes that you go through to have at least a reasonable way of evaluating people who have more expertise in an area than you do. So I think probably the biggest thing to do is to listen to a consensus of many experts over an opinion of one expert. No one expert is definitive. Any one person can be wrong, could be a complete outlier. But if you have, organizations that have some legitimacy, like they're not an ideological organization or exist for the purpose of pushing an agenda, but they're like a university or a professional organization, et cetera. And they say, yeah, we put together a panel of experts and they recommend this. This is how they, like the American Medical Association, for example, or any other like medical professional organization who say, yeah, we reviewed the evidence and this is the standard of care that we think is the case. Or, the Intergovernmental panel on climate change. Yeah, we have 3,000 climate scientists got together and they go, yeah, this is 95% likely what's going on. You can't put that up against one person as an expert in isolation and say that they're equivalent. So I think that's, if you just did that, just sought out, what seemingly objective consensus opinion among the greatest number of experts possible, you're much more likely to be correct than listening to one guy on YouTube, no matter what his credentials seem to be.
When it comes to medications, would it be rather than what one person says or a small study one doctor did, saying the standard is sort of like the randomized controlled trial, and that would be what we look to?
Yeah, well, that's certainly, now you're saying what is the standard of evidence within that field,
Yeah.
right? So certainly with drugs and with a lot of medical treatments, the standard is the randomized trial. But it's more than that, actually. It's a systematic review of multiple randomized controlled trials.
Gotcha.
One trial doesn't really tell you anything because any one trial could be a quirky result. It could be, you don't know what the pattern is. Statistically speaking, you can't make many firm conclusions based on one study. But once you see what the pattern of evidence is among many studies, and that requires an expert systematic review, which is a great way, by the way, to get a good, quick idea of what is the consensus of opinion about this medical topic, is look at some, high quality systematic reviews. Then that tells you what's likely to be the case, because then you're seeing a pattern of evidence, not just one piece of evidence.
Right now, what set of factually false beliefs? I'm not using the term conspiracy theory because sometimes it's not really a conspiracy theory. It's just people believe something that's not true. What's the most concerning or to you, or that you believe is most damaging to us in society right now?
Well, I mean, certainly anti-vaccine attitudes are incredibly harmful, especially in the middle of a pandemic. I mean, it's definitely slowing down and impairing our ability to tamp down this pandemic, increasing the odds that new variants are going to emerge and prolong, the pandemic. So that's definitely, in the short term, that's probably the biggest thing. Long term, I have to say climate change. The conversation we need to be having is how best to avoid the worst case scenarios of climate change, how to mitigate the expensive, and very disruptive effects that are already happening and we know we're going to be getting worse. rather than the endless discussion of is it happening, or trying to do whatever we can to avoid reducing fossil fuel company profits, which is I think what most of the pushback is really all about. We sort of get stuck spinning our wheels, and again, that's on purpose. That's by design. Literally there are paid PR experts who spread fear, uncertainty, and doubt to delay things as much as possible. It's just so easy for that to happen because it's just easy to generate the sort of false skepticism, this what I call science denial, in order to prolong the discussion in this preliminary phase of is it happening? Is there anything we can do about it? And then, of course, to sort of nitpick and shoot down any proposed solutions rather than engage meaningfully with what is the best solutions to this problem, what will minimize any short-term negative economic impact, what's going to have the greatest chance of succeeding long-term, et cetera. And there's lots of great proposals on the table, and it's happening. It's just we just need to accelerate it so that we can again avoid risking some tipping points or the worst outcome. So in the long run for humanity, I think that's the biggest issue that we're facing.
There are people who sometimes categorize false beliefs with a very fine line between them. The ones that are materially damaging, like you point out, climate science denial, preventing us from actually putting in place some real infrastructure here to deal with this, or anti-vax is literally prolonging a pandemic. And then they'll say, okay, and then there's a fine line. And on the other side, there's stuff that's basically benign, like flat Earth, for example.
Yeah.
I've spoken to psychologists who specialize in paranoid and conspiracist beliefs and different people who say it's not really that fine of a line because often something seemingly benign like flat Earth belief is associated with people with anti-Semitic conspiracy theories that they believe, or there's overlap with the anti-vax movement or whatever. Can you give us your sense of whether there really are these two categories or whether it's much more of a gray area?
Oh, there aren't two categories. It's all just a continuum of one thing.
Okay.
There's certainly more or less direct harm or demonstrable harm from certain belief systems. Like if you believe that modern medicine is a conspiracy, and you should treat all things with prayer or drinking your own urine or whatever, something bizarre like that, which
Yep.
people actually believe, by the way, that's sort of you could easily see how immediately harmful that can be. There's the other beliefs, so like flat earther, for example, or belief in ghosts is one well, who cares if people believe in ghosts? It's the harm is not as obvious, but it's still there. You may need to dig a little bit to see what the tangible physical harm is, but there's also epistemological harm, right? When people believe in magic, when they don't understand the basics of how science is working, when they believe it's all a conspiracy, you are setting them up for the harmful conspiracy to come, the more immediate, obviously harmful thing. And sometimes it's not that long a trip there. Like if you believe in magic, you believe in astrology or whatever, then you're much more likely to be hoodwinked by, let's say, a psychic who, we know there are fraudulent psychics out there who steal millions of dollars from people. I mean, that's not harmless. So, the harm may be a little bit more secondary and harder to quantify, but it's there. And when you do this, for a living for a long time, you see the harm. Even if it's a little bit downstream, there's tremendous harm from believing in magic. It makes you incredibly vulnerable. It is not isolated. And so, we should not think of these things as benign at all.
Do we all have some of these beliefs? Like, for example, I think of myself as someone who follows science, and I ask myself, why do I believe this or that? But just like to pick something random, oftentimes when I'm traveling somewhere new and eating some food I've not had, I'll mention, I really hope this doesn't make me sick. And I think on some level, I think that by mentioning it, I'm kind of like putting it out, and it's like less likely that a weird new food in some new country will. I don't really believe that. I know that the thing I say doesn't actually make a difference, but it's sort of like one of these, it's a false belief. It doesn't really have an impact on whether a food will make me sick. Do we all have some of these things, do you think?
Oh, sure. So, no one is intellectually pristine, right? So you know, humans are predisposed to superstitious thinking, like what you're saying, and sometimes we engage in that for fun or for comfort, or for because of tradition or ritual. When we know intellectually, like, yes, there's no magic here. This is not actually true. I cannot ward off food poisoning by saying I hope this isn't poisonous, but you still do it. That's I think is benign if you know intellectually this is not
Yeah.
true, and it's just part of just human behavior. Although some people like to police that within themselves as well, just because they think it could help keep their critical thinking skills focused, which is fine as well. But also in terms of what we actually believe, no one's belief system is, or what they hold to be true, is perfect either, right? It's just impossible to get to that point where, yes, I purged myself of all inaccurate conclusions and false beliefs, and everything I believe is 100% accurate, true, and precise. That's an aspirational goal that we will never get to. The real difference between people are those who engage in metacognition and those who don't. What's metacognition? It's basically thinking about thinking. It's turning a analytical eye towards your own thinking processes and trying to understand how you come to conclusions, how you come to believe things, examining, improving, tweaking that process, being open to changing your beliefs based upon evidence and logic, etc. And those people who don't really actively engage in metacognition, they sort of go with their psychological process level. They're just sort of they're following the current, the mental current, to whatever conclusion it brings them to, and not examining the process. So you're never going to be somebody whose beliefs are pristinely perfect, but you can be somebody who examines everything they believe and is willing to change their mind. And so again, we say it's a journey, it's a process. If you live your life as somebody who can get less and less wrong, over time, that's the best you can do. But it's better than remaining in a position where you're not even examining your beliefs and you're just going with whatever your id is telling you to believe.
That makes a lot of sense. Last thing I want to talk about, changing other people's minds. There are many folks I've spoken to who say, at the wholesale, like at a societal level, when we see rapid changing of minds, it's often coming at the hands of authoritarianism, dictatorship, the Chinese Cultural Revolution, etc. If we think more at the retail level of individuals, it's building relationships and often applying a sort of Socratic type method of questioning to get other people to say, hey, maybe I'm not as solidly grounded in this belief as I thought I was. Do you agree that that is a good method? And it seems like it takes a very long time to change minds.
Well, yeah. So it depends on context, and people ask us this question all the time and say, well, what's your relationship? What are your goals? What's your investment? If you're playing the long game, right? This is somebody that you have a long-term relationship with, et cetera. Or even if on a wholesale level where you're trying to influence culture or organizations or institutions, you have to play the long game. You can't just browbeat somebody with a belief and expect them to change their mind. It's far better to just give them critical thinking skills, establish a little baseline of scientific literacy, some media savvy, and let them come to that conclusion by themselves. Sometimes a good way to do this is, again, find common ground. I like to say, just find something that someone is skeptical about and ask them why they're skeptical about that. So you're saying you don't believe in ancient astronauts or whatever, pick something. Find something they don't believe in. Say, why don't you believe in that? Why? And then they will usually, give a pretty skeptical reason for why that there's no evidence. It doesn't make any sense or whatever. And you say, that's right. And then you just engage their skepticism and try to nurture that, grow that, generalize those skills, and once they see that's right, people believed this and that was wrong, and how does that work? And they begin to generalize their skepticism, and then eventually they'll turn it more inward, and hopefully more and more things will fall. To really hardcore skeptics, like all belief falls eventually, like everything gets subjected to the skeptical eye. So that's the goal, but that is absolutely the long game. That's years. It's a process. And even for seasoned skeptics, we still will fall prey to emotional beliefs or misinformation, or not realize that we're being ideological when we think we're being logical. It's hard. It's not easy, though. It's a complicated world, and there's a lot of misinformation out there. And our brains are really flawed, at doing this. We're only semi-rational creatures. So at best it's a process, but if you engage in it either personally or with other people, trying to get them to be more skeptical, it's a lifelong process.
That's interesting. I mean, thinking out loud about an issue that we're dealing with right now, which is people blaming Joe Biden for a lot of things that either happened before he was president or that are happening in other countries, rather than the approach of, well, what did he do to cause that? I wonder if there would be something to saying, hey, listen, do you blame Joe Biden for the Challenger disaster? And
Yeah.
most people would probably say, well, no, I don't. And maybe there's an opportunity to say, well, why not? And they might give some reasons which then would also apply to some
Yeah.
of the areas that they're blaming him today.
Yeah, that's a good approach. I like to take the approach myself,
Yeah.
for myself, but also to other people. It's like, imagine if there were a president of your party president right now, and this were happening. What would you say? Just do the thought experiment.
Right.
Would you just say, "Oh yeah, we totally blame them for everything, just as much as I?" Would you really? But think about it. Really
Right.
put yourself in that position and just say, if you had to that, and that's sort of the devil's advocate approach. Like, if you had to defend the other position, what would you say? Always a great thought experiment. It gets people engaging with the other side, and then pretty soon, like, yeah, just getting them to think that way makes them think that way. The psychologists have demonstrated that frequently. Just if you tell people to just pretend they have a position, they actually move towards that position. If you tell people just pretend we're thinking skeptically here for a minute, and then do that as an exercise, it actually gets them thinking more skeptically.
That's super interesting. That's a very good idea. We've been speaking with Dr. Stephen Novella, who is the host and producer of the award-winning podcast, The Skeptic's Guide to the Universe, and lead author of the book by the same name. Such a pleasure having you on. I really appreciate it.
A lot of fun. Thanks for having me.